Boas, I have returned, unlike the dad who goes to buy a pack of cigarettes. And today I have a new series on YouTube, facing boring openings and what to do against it. If you like me, you like a position that is open, attacking potential, and you don't like to be slow maneuvering game where you put the pieces and you have symmetrical opening. So obviously we're gonna start with the boring opening d4. I know d4 has a lot of options, but if the opponent wants to play boring opening from the white side, you're gonna have to stick with it. So this way, I'm trying to teach you some variations, some possible pet lines, let's say, that you might use to take advantage of it. So in this case, I'll start with the queen pawn game d4, and as I normally play knight f6, sometimes I'm faced with knight f3, the knight's variation of the Indian defense. As you look at it, if you play this variation, is gonna be very, very boring. Unless you have something sharp, it is really easy just to be yourself in a boring game where you're slow, where you're slightly worse. D5, symmetrical G3, the C4 never gets played, C3, bishop F4, I mean, boring. So this way, I'm gonna focus on one variation, C5, the so-called Spielman Indian. So in this opening, we are attacking this pawn, and most importantly, we are provoking white to go d5. I've split this video into three sections, as I normally do. In the first section, I explore the most common and the most, let's say, principled reply, that is to push the pawn. In this case, my suggestion to you is to play the move b5. This, I think, is what gives the most interesting game. As you can see, you already pushed two pawns. This is not going to be a boring game. But if they do not play b5, they can play something like to defend the pawn. Boring, I know, but still the position is going to be a little more open and a little more interesting if you like that things. I'm going to show you later. And finally, I have split, but as I said, I've split this into three groups. The first was if you play d5, the second if you play c3 or e3, and the last one all the other moves like bishop f4, c4, uh, knight c3 or g3. These I think are the most common replies. You don't face many things after that, or of course capture the pawn. But let's get to it. So to start, let's go. I have already here, as usual, my Alicia study. So now let's look at the black side of it. And so if they play d4, if they play d4, we got to this position. They play knight f3, you go c5. If they play d5, the most principal reply, you play b5. b5 can be met with several options, as I've highlighted here. In a normal scenario, I always advise you, if they play such breaks as c4 or a4, always reply with b4. b4 also avoiding the capture prevents the knight from developing to its natural square on c3. If they push the pawn to attack it again, you just ignore it and play g6. If they remember that when they do, you play d6, and this game is very comfortable for black. You have space to open your bishop, you have space to put your knight. If they trade, you trade. You're ready to castle. It's an imbalanced game, and maneuvering, yes, but more open than a symmetrical opening. Sorry about the engine. Imagine if they play a4 here, you simply play this. If they play c4, you ignore it. You play g6, bishop, e6, try to break the structure. Maybe put the bishop here, target the pawns. You have a comfortable position. Other moves that might be challenging are bishop g5 and e4. Bishop g5, I recommend you to play queen b6. The most common reply you'll face probably is bishop takes. Here, I recommend you taking with the queen, attacking this pawn. So white's gonna have to defend it. As you see, the masters in chess database, the most common way of playing is c3, and after c3, I recommend you going back in order to defend this pawn. So if they play e4, now you can play g6. The pawn is already defended, and you don't have to worry about e5 getting your queen trapped. And you have the white has more space, it's true, but you have two bishops and a position that is imbalanced and is sharp, so you avoid what you're trying to avoid. Lastly, just to mention a specific variation that is not very common, but you need to be wary of, which is e4. E4 might not seem a very good move, but with a specific line, if you now have to take the pawn, of course, unless you want to meet d4, e4, after you take, they don't take, because if you take, you have a really nice way of just getting that bishop. But now they play bishop d3. And if they play bishop d3, you gotta play queen a5 anyway, but now probably you'll face knight d2. Here, I would argue that, importantly, you need to bring the knight back, avoid the contact, and if they castle, I recommend you playing c4 in order to avoid getting overrun. But now you need to be careful with this variation, which are only moves on both sides here. d6, stopping any shenanigans on the diagonal. But I think if the opponent ignores and plays slower, for example, rook e1, now you just can play just here, and the bishop has nowhere to go, and you just are gonna ready to castle. And on the other end, the bishop from white is not moving anytime soon because the knight is also not moving anytime soon. But in this case, white can be provocative and play a4, to which you need to reply with g6, ignoring because the pawn cannot take as it's pinned. But now you face an important move, knight e4. This move is annoying and it's not very common. But if white knows this move, and you see that in Masters game they know this move, and you can see that if they play such a thing, you see that now white can develop, and this pawn becomes a bit weak when you try to castle. So if you play bishop g7, they take the pawn because now knight takes is possible. So you're gonna have to spend a move defending it. But this gives white enough tempo to play rook e1 or bishop f3 first, and after play bishop g7, they play rook e1. Here you cannot castle or you lose the pawn, and you need to be careful with developing your knight, because such thing would avoid it meeting rook g7. If you take, well, that's fork. That's why you need to be careful and play this knight back, so that unleashing the bishop and forcing the knight to move. If they play c3, well, you can play knight e5 as you see, and now you block and you are ready to play something like castles. So let's move on to our second chapter. Uh, when you after c5, well, marked as a good move. If they play e3 or c3, now you play d5. If d5 is the best move to face both of these, in this case, if they the plan is simple. If they ignore, for example, as you can see, the most common move played is bishop f4 here. Well, just play the knight, play even bishop f5, even if you play e6, and they play something like bishop d3, bishop d6. I mean, this position is, you can see by the eval, is totally similar. If they castle, well, you can try. If they try here, queen b6, position is balanced. A bit symmetrical, I would say, but in the end balanced. But more often than not, you'll face the word capture. Capture, you don't need to face this move. If they play e6, well, if you they capture, you play e6, and if they play b4, well, go for the typical queen's gambit. I don't know how to play it, I never played it, but I know what to do. If they try to defend the pawn, just attack the structure. If they attack the structure, well, if they try to do not do anything, you're just gonna take. And when they take, you play b6. And well, as you can see, you have solved all your problems. And in this case, if they take, well, position is very nice, you try to play 45. If they don't let you take, well, as you see, this position, after you play b6, gets very easy to play. If they play bishop e5, well, bishop e7, takes. Well, this position, if they take, you take. If they push, you take there. So after this, well, you can just take, and you're ready to take the pawn next. And you have a really interesting position where this bishop is gonna go somewhere here. This knight doesn't have many clear prospects, and you have a good game. It is already equalized, as you can see. So I'm just gonna show you something after e3, which is similar. You play d5. The only move you might need to be concerned about, well, if you play c3, well, obviously you have position is this bishop is never getting out, and you have a clear path for this one, knight c6 and e5. Finally, if they take, well, e6, and if they defend, a5 is the same thing as we mentioned. I would say the most challenging way of approaching this would be to play c4, and if they play c4, well, you just take, and after they take, you play knight c6, if they play knight c3, play bishop g4, and after this move, you transpose into a Karoka. So, it's true, it's different, but if you are trying to avoid boring openings, and normally you are a e4 player, and now you have a e4 position, so you are probably happy. So, moving on to the last chapter of our video, today we'll see the other moves as they can play other than d5, e3, or c6, or c3. So, I would say that uh, some of them are not very challenging, as if they play, for example, g3, you can just take and gain tempos on the pieces that are here. It's something like c6, knight e5, bishop type take, and quickly castle. If they play knight c3, it's the same thing. You just castle, gain tempos on their pieces, and if they play bishop c4 as well, you take and you gain tempos on their pieces. Try to already play for forks. So I would say that, and as well, you need to just be aware of the move here bishop c5, taking on the pawn on c5, but you just play e6, and after they play e6, if they try to defend it, well, you should just chip away, and you see that black is much better there. So we're probably just gonna face e3, but now his position. I mean, bishop is not going anywhere. You can just castle, develop, d5, probably 5, bishop out. Everything is nice. So let's just approach the most challenging other of the other options, which is c4. As you can see, this transposes into an English, and if you don't like the English, you certainly If you don't like boring variations, you certainly don't like the English. But as you can see, this opening is not going to be such boring, such annoying opening. As you can see, if you take and they take with the knight, well, just play e5. If they return somewhere, you are fine, you are developed. If they play here, you defend the pawn, try to play sometimes for e4. Now you just need to be careful of this variation, which is, as you can see, theory to play d5. d5 as an interesting position is to take if this pawn to play bishop c5. Bishop c5, I that f2 square, so normally, if you play someone who doesn't know how to play, they will play e3. If they know what they are doing, they will play here, defending the pawn with both pieces, and now you castle. If they play here, well, knight g4 just ends the game, as you can see by the eval bar. But if they play g3, which is probably the best move, well, I just recommend you to play queen b6, force the e3 pawn to move, and play bishop f5. Bishop f5 has a clear intention that if they play here, you can play e4 yourself, and this pawn is very weak. Even if they castle, try to get the bishop, you can just simply play here, and after they take here, knight, this pawn is going to fall. This bishop is still takes two moves to develop to a more active square, and in the meantime, you can bring your both rooks, and the position is very nice. So that concludes our first episode on facing or openings. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have some suggestions, just leave it in the comments. At the same time, as usual, you can check the link of this Lichess study on the description. So bye everyone, and see you next time.